And my name is Radha Ruparal. Welcome to this People First Talk. Just in case anyone is new to this space, let me frame up why we're here again today. So this is a convening of the People First community. And the People First community is a coalition of actors coming together across sectors who have this shared belief that if we want to achieve sustainable development, we have to invest in leadership. So it's not about interventions, but it's really around people and leadership, and particularly this idea of local leadership. So for the last year, we've been having this series of People First talks where we've been learning from different organizations across sectors around these two questions of, well, what's the leadership we need? And what are we each learning around what it takes to cultivate that? So today I'm really excited because we have two special guests from Teach for All with us. And we're going to get a chance to learn from them. So we've got Wendy Kopp, who is the CEO and co-founder of Teach for All, and also the founder of Teach for America. And we have Khadija here with us, who is the CEO of Teach for Pakistan. And I'll be facilitating this conversation, but in today's conversation, I also have a dual role because I'm also with Teach for All, and I had our Global Leadership Accelerator. So we'll be bringing my perspective into the conversation as well. Okay, so let's get started. Let me start, Wendy and Khadija, before I turn it over to you, let me just frame up a little bit about Teach for All for those who are not familiar. So Teach for All is a global network of independent, locally led organizations in 60 countries around the world. So Khadija leads one of those local organizations, Teach for Pakistan. And we also have a global organization that fosters sharing and learning across borders, so across this global network. Now, in each country, so in Pakistan, for example, the local organization works to recruit the nation's young, most promising leaders from all different backgrounds and all parts of society to devote and commit 2 years to teach in the highest needs communities. But that's just the first step. You know, the big idea is how do we grow this growing force of leaders in each nation who not only commit 2 years to teach in schools, but also the majority of them stay on for a lifetime, you know, informed by that experience in those 2 years to say, we want to commit to affecting systemic change from all parts of the system. So some stay on in schools as teachers and school leaders, others go on to become policy leaders, but they're all united by the shared purpose of how do we affect systemic change so that all children in our nations have the opportunity to fulfill their potential. So Khadija is going to bring that local perspective, and in each context, it's really locally rooted, locally grounded. And then to zoom out, Wendy will be able to give us the global perspective because these 60 partners are united together by the shared set of unifying principles, these shared principles and core values that guide us. And so from Wendy, we'll get a chance to hear about, well, how are we fostering leadership across these 60 organizations, and what are our biggest learnings around how to affect systemic change that way? So with that, let's get right into it. Wendy, I think I'll start with you. So, you know, our network's core purpose, you know, in the language, it's this idea of growing collective leadership so all children can fulfill their potential. So let's start by unpacking that term. When you say collective leadership, you know, what do you mean, or what do we mean in our network?
Thank you, Radha, and hello, everyone. So we think about collective leadership as, you know, we're trying to convey that means not one leader at the top of a hierarchy, right? It means people at every level of systems, like in our case, you know, focusing on outcomes for kids around the whole ecosystem around kids at every level of the education system, policy, social innovators, and others working outside the system, people working inside the system. We're trying to convey that we mean a diverse group of those folks. So, you know, people who've experienced the inequities we're addressing and their allies, people who have greater privilege in the system. You know, part of this is a thought that all of those folks are exerting agency and leadership with shared purpose, vision, and values, and in relationship with each other, like that there's enough space among folks that they can develop relationships and learn together and collaborate together. So I think it's all of those notions, you know, wrapped up in this notion of collective leadership.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. So many big ideas in there, right? So many diverse people exerting leadership towards shared purpose. But Khadija, I'd love to hear from you. So you're now leading one of these local organizations. Why does collective leadership matter to you, and what fuels your conviction in it?
Yeah, thanks, Radha. I think that's a question that I think about very often, because it's a question that's very, very central to why we do what we do, and the very specific way in which we want to do it. Particularly in Pakistan's context, I think we've had a very checkered past. It's a very nascent democracy, and a fledgling one at the moment. And the way that power has been concentrated and held in the system, it's been held in the hands of very few people, across a handful of organizations, and that it's been that way for the past 75 odd years. Right? And so when we think about how to change the way that power flows, because that I think is central, right? If you want to evolve systems, make them more equitable, make them work for people whom they have typically marginalized in the past, then you have to change how power flows through systems. And the only way to counter this very, very concentrated power is to build more power. And the only way that honestly we could think of doing that in a way that's authentic and legitimate, truly deeply legitimate, is to build a movement, and make sure that we build power off of all of these kinds of incredible people who hold very alternative views about what we want for kids as a country and how we're going to go out and get it, and have those voices connect and work with each other through all the key points, across not just education, but as Wendy was talking about, across policy and politics, and people who make financial decisions, business sector, people who work with communities, right? And that's what we believe is the true potential of what we call collective leadership.
Yeah, I love that, Khadija. And you connect a bit to some of Wendy's points around, I think you really brought to life what we mean when we say diverse leadership. And I love this idea of thinking about growing a new type of power, particularly that which brings in those who have the lived experience of some of the inequities. But as you said, also business leaders and educators and policy leaders and government leaders, but also community leaders. I think you really bring to life what we mean when we say diverse leadership. So thank you for that. Wendy, anything to add on that, as you think about the why of collective leadership? Yeah, anything to react to Khadija's comments, or what else is there for you?
I feel like when so many people for so many years, like I hear so many people talk about system change as another word for policy change. And I guess in my experience, and I think our collective experience in education, at least, if we're talking about system change, like if by that we mean aggregate outcomes for, a whole system are improving, we're not going to get that through policy change alone. It takes change in policy, change in practice, change in culture. So it just follows, like, government, we need the government leaders exerting leadership towards a purpose of all kids thriving, right? But that won't be enough. Like, they need they need people at every other level of the system and inside and outside the system. Like, that's the only way to change not only policy, but practice and culture. So I guess to me, that's the big why. The other thing I would just share, I'm just kind of obsessing about this new research that just came out of the RISE project. This was the project that Lant Pritchett led for more than a decade. I think it's the biggest educational research project in the history of the world, and it looked at school systems in low and low to middle income countries. And it found that many of them, in fact, have not improved over the last 40 years. In fact, some of them have really gotten worse, but they were trying to figure out what is at work when the systems are improving. And I've probably read this, I don't know how many times, because it's kind of hard to process, like, exactly what is this? What are the findings telling us? But what I ultimately have taken from that research is, they're telling us that the big difference in the systems that are improving are that they are purpose-driven, that there's a sense of purpose felt at every level of the system, and actually much more broadly at the level of society, towards students learning, like towards the purpose of students learning versus, say, other purposes. And so essentially this study is showing, like, the systems that are improving are those that want to improve, right? Like, and there are those that have then everything aligned to that, and they have the capacity to, develop and adapt solutions and continuously improve towards this big purpose that's uniting everyone. And so in essence, that study is telling us that, often there's this search for like the solutions, the pedagogical strategies, the thing that could improve the whole system. And I think what this study is telling us is there's no one thing, right? Like there's no one solution. This is about figuring out how do we build, collective leadership towards the purpose, towards a common purpose of all kids learning and thriving. That's kind of what I take from it. So to me, that research was just very affirming of this notion that brings all of us in the People First community and all of us across Teach for All together.
Yeah, it's so important. Sometimes we don't even step back on those bigger questions around purpose, but this is the big idea of what happens when you have many different people working together towards that shared purpose. And Khadija, tell us about that in your context. What are your reflections on this idea of different solutions, many different people working together towards a shared purpose? How does that play out in Pakistan?
Yeah, it's interesting to be talking about this within this People First community, because I think it's a group of believers, frankly. But I find it so strange when often you just sit down and you talk about ambitious pieces of system reform, and it can be any subject really. But within education, it can be about curriculum or assessments or getting meals to kids or technology use or anything. And it's almost like every piece of system reform is trying to currently that I see being talked about or being thought about is almost trying to avoid the people problem, and treating people as a problem. And so I think it's such a fallacy because you can't, right? Because when we talk about systems as if they are people-less, and therefore we will change them, almost thinking about how do we make people irrelevant. But I think in our context, we've learned pretty much a lot of what Wendy was just saying. Is just this what we've seen happen is when you infect people with purpose, which I think is essentially what this program does, it doesn't kind of go away. It stays. And B, I think the kind of snowball effect that it creates with these infected people going on, and I know I'm using the term infection, and I'm trying to reclaim it from all of what we experienced with regards to that word in the last 2.5 years. But it's almost like when these people infected with purpose go out and connect and bounce off of these other people in all of these other institutions, it's like you create that's what momentum is like. And we've seen that in such incredible ways. In Pakistan, when I started doing this work about 13 odd years ago, the only conversation that was happening around education was about access. And I think in just the 13 years, and a lot of it, I think, has been driven by people from the Teach for Pakistan community who have done this work with kids and then gone out into various, like the largest nonprofits and most influential nonprofits working in education in the country, working directly with government, working with aid agencies and donor agencies that influence government priorities, and all basically raising the same agenda that access doesn't work without quality. And we've seen that discourse shift 180 degrees in Pakistan, where now today, what I saw 13 years ago is completely unrecognizable. And I'll give you a more recent example when, and also goes back to what you and Wendy were talking about rather earlier about, it's not just about changing policy. So we've had a law on the books against corporal punishment in schools for the longest time. But the implementation of the law it takes so much time to make that happen. And it had just been sitting on the books for a long time. And just in the result of the past 5 years of the noise that Teach for Pakistan fellows and alumni and this entire community has made within the federal capital system, we're now seeing that law actually become policy, come up with a system, and go into motion. And it'll still take some time, but for that to happen, I think to me is a real sign of exactly what we were talking about. I think this idea of building a movement around purpose and then letting that movement do its thing, believing in that.
Yeah, wow, Khadija, that just brings it to life. Such a real example, but you need people at all levels. You need the teachers who are seeing it in the classrooms, but then you need the policy leaders. I also like what you said about a movement and just enabling people to lead in their different ways, right? Recognizing that you need multiple people. I'm here today in Estonia, and I just met 4 alumni, and we just had the same conversation around what is the purpose of education. And they all had similar ideas. In Estonia, it really is around building self-aware, independent children who have emotional capabilities. And yet they're working at it from different parts. You know, one is in the Ministry of Education, and the other is a classroom teacher for 10 years, and the other is a headmistress of a school, and the other is working on an anti-bullying campaign. And it was just incredible to watch their conversation, because they were able to talk about this shared purpose, but they were also able to battle each other and say, here's what's working, here's what's not working. And that debate was just so powerful. So I guess that gets me into my next question, and maybe Khadija, I'll turn it over to you, right? So if this is the type of leadership we want to develop, you know, diverse people at all levels of the system working together towards shared, you know, challenges to make sure we don't have corporal punishment, but also to these bigger ideals of all children learning, all children developing the capacities to lead change in this growing uncertain world. Well, the big question is, how do we do that? Because that is not what oftentimes we've been grown up to believe leadership is. That actually goes counter to a lot of the leadership models we've been socialized with. So yeah, Khadija, maybe just in a, you know, in your context, practically, like walk us through how one of these program works. What's your biggest learnings around how to do this?
Yeah, I think the first one is, you know, when we talk about developing leadership, I think thinking about the question of who are we looking for to develop, whose leadership skills do we want to develop further? And I think in that, the biggest lesson has been, you know, Teach for Pakistan has come a long way in thinking about and shifting its orientation to who do we really want in this program? Who do we go after? And I think the biggest learning has been, if we want people to be able to work from across all of these key points in the system, then we have to go and find leadership potential across, you know, the wide spectrum that we have of young people in this country. And so I think in the past, we used to think about, let's think about who is going to, who do we know or can guess will hold positions of power and influence later on in their lives, and how do we work to build their ownership over this mission? And so let's target that group of people. And we still do that, but I think much more over time, we have also started to think about, but who has really experienced inequity and therefore is going to be able to care about this no matter what else is happening in their lives, and will work to ensure that no other child experiences what they've gone through, because it's that personal for them. And think about how can we get this leadership opportunity to that group, to the potential leaders there. And I think we've been blown away by what happens when you bring both those, you know, and I'm talking about these as if they're very different, like the extremes of the spectrum, but they're not. But when you pull in people from all across the spectrum, and then you help them connect with each other, right? I think that's been a really big one. I think the other really dramatic learning that I've had is over time, you know, we have so many different kinds of, like, leadership is a buzzword in and of itself. Of course it is. And as you were saying, Radha, so much theory around it and so many ways of developing leadership, right? There's a how-to book on every bookshelf about leadership. But realizing that really the beauty and the impact of this work, this model, is what happens over the course of those 2 years, working directly with kids, day in and day out, struggling with kids, understanding who they are, where they come from, what they care about, what their daily challenge is, how the system responds to them, how it breaks them in many cases, being hurt by that, and working then to overcome that in this small system of their classroom, their school, their community. And I think to us, the real lesson is we do a lot of work to prepare and support people on how to do that core work, and then reflect on what they're learning from that core work. But the core work is the work that happens in the classroom, right? And in the schools, working directly with kids. So I think that's kind of 2 of my biggest lessons around building leadership.
Yeah, I love that, Khadija, right? The who matters a lot, the diversity, but yeah, the leadership, you know, it's not a training, it's not a it's actually the 2 years where you're working, deeply and having that experience and being proximate to the challenges, like that's where leadership goes. And again, it's the same thing I'm seeing here when I'm in classrooms in Estonia. It's the same thing we hear all around the world. We'll dig into a little bit more around, again, how do you foster that leadership? But yeah, Wendy, anything you want to add around this, around, what are we learning around the how?
I kind of just want to reinforce what Khadija just shared. I mean, so first of all, on the first point, I actually think this is under thought about as a society. Like, this question of, are we doing enough to recruit and select people to channel their energy into sustainable development? Or in our case, into education and expanding opportunity for kids. Like, if you look at what the private sector does, it really is a war for talent out there. And even for the most diverse talent at this point in the world, thank heavens, right? But you should see what these companies put into this. And, I guess to me, that's one of the biggest things. Like, we need to be aggressively recruiting people who've demonstrated that, they're going to tackle big things and persevere in the face of those big challenges into this work to make the world better. And, personally, I think we have a much greater responsibility than we've assumed as a society. Like, especially our universities should be fostering critical inquiry. I mean, it's not all the same difference, like putting your energy into one thing versus another. Like, we need to do more than see this generation that's more committed to diversity, equity, inclusiveness, and sustainability than any that have come before. Like, they need to live into those values, not just by, tweeting or going to protests, which can be helpful, but like really think critically about, what am I going to do with my full-time energy? Because we really need a lot of energy to tackle these unjust systems, right? So I just wanted to underscore, on the one hand, the recruitment and selection point. Like, I think that's a really huge point. And especially to recruit the people who we believe need to be leading this work, the people who have lived experience of inequity. Those are the toughest folks to recruit, right? Because they have so many pressures on them. And so figuring out, how do we facilitate that? How do we find these folks? Like, it's just, anyway, I think we need to put a lot of energy into that. I also just so resonate with Khadija's point about the 2 years. It's so interesting, you all, because I used to think, like, my previous life was at Teach for America. And I mean, we just put so much energy into like continuously improving every single piece of this puzzle, right? Like, how do you recruit? How do you select? How do you, provide the pre-service orientation and the training? I mean, I thought that the impact we were seeing was because of exactly how we were doing each thing. And so it's been so fascinating now to see such similar effects across such diverse contexts, where folks are really doing all those things a lot differently. But like, the one common thing is that they're immersing everyone in the very big challenge of teaching, and putting around them a culture and coaching and support and all. And so it's just been so fascinating. Like, we've been working with a researcher out of Berkeley, who has been doing studies across multiple countries, looking at what happens to these people during the 2 years. And it's a fascinating set of research, right? Like, they take people who just barely got into these organizations, whether it's Enseña Peru or Teach for Australia or Teach for India or Teach for America or the next one. And so people who barely got in, people who barely didn't. So they're right on the admissions line. They look so similar to each other at the front end. And they do a whole battery of assessments, like beliefs, mindsets, et cetera. And then they do it again 2 years later. And they see a little bit of difference. It shows the selection model does work. Like, the people who believe most in kids in low-income communities are more likely to be accepted, but they see that difference grows so much. And the fascinating thing is that the effects are so similar from place to place. So, irrespective of where people are committing to commit 2 years to teach, they come to believe much more in their students' potential and in the potential of families and kids in low-income communities. they come to believe more in their own potential to make a difference, and they completely change the way they see the nature of the problem and solution that we're tackling. Like, they come in thinking the answer is technical funding all over the world. Like, if we just had more funding, and they come out thinking this is a big systemic challenge that takes adaptive change. And so what I've seen over time is, wow, like, so it's not just that we're bringing people in with a lot of leadership potential. It's that those 2 years of teaching change these folks, and turn them into the leaders we need, right? Like, people who believe in their students, have a sense of possibility, get that there's no one silver bullet solution, and that we're going to need to take it on, in a systemic and adaptive way. So I just wanted to underscore the point, because I think no end of talking with people and whatnot could have the kind of deep impact of assuming full-time responsibility for kids in a culture which expects the adults to succeed, right? And I will say also, like, the researcher who's done this is part of a community of researchers who look for interventions that drive civic engagement. And she said it's a very depressed group of people, because almost nothing does. Like, most of the studies they do don't show effects, and she just can't get over the effect sizes in this study, which are just really significant. And the last thing I'll say that Khadija referenced, which really stands out, I think, as we reflect on what works across the organizations in our network, is just the point about, like, constantly pulling these folks together and enabling the relationship building, the intentional reflection. I think we've found that's important, both to support folks in processing, during these very intense 2 years, but ongoingly. Like we've tested a lot of different things to try to accelerate the leadership of these folks after the 2 years of teaching. And there are various programs that kind of help facilitate and speed up their kind of leadership trajectory, like helping support them to get into school principalships or ministries or to launch social enterprises. And those are really important. But one thing that's really important is continuing to bring them together intentionally to reflect on, how are we doing against this big goal that we have of ensuring that all kids in our country can fulfill their potential, and what more do we need to be doing individually and collectively? Like, we just find there's just such power in kind of fostering that community and a reflective community.
Yeah, such a great point, Wendy, around this, coming back around this core community. And Khadija, can you share how you do this in Pakistan? I remember when we were talking before, you said this power of reflection, bringing together this diverse community. You do that from the get-go, from the beginning of the fellowship. Just share how that happens at the beginning of the fellowship, and then how you're doing that with your different alumni in your context. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think I'm going to try and keep myself from going into and here are all of the 100,000 strategies that we put into motion. But I think if I were to draw out some core principles, I think, for us, day one of this experience begins with everybody a little bit disoriented in a space where they're together, and starting with thinking about what are the values that we're going to lead with. I think that's the first thing that we share, we talk to our people about, because I think if we, even before the exposure to schools and kids and communities and parents starts, I think it starts with thinking about who are we now and who do we want to be. And so from there on, it is the welcoming them into the Teach for Pakistan world really means welcoming them to connect with, learn from, learn about our students, their parents, the other teachers who work in the schools alongside them, our alumni, the older cohort of fellows that's already working in the classroom. So I think the initial point, it's about we are going to come together as a community, and then there is a lot of first of all opening up oneself and diving deep and learning more about, reflecting more on who am I today and what has brought me into this, so that you can connect with why you're here, and then connect with the other person's why are they here, right? And I think we talked a little bit, I was speaking a little bit earlier about building shared power. And for us, a lot of that means you and I may have experienced pain in a very different way because we've experienced injustice in very different ways based on our identities. But we have that experience, and together we are going to be able to take that pain and that feeling of injustice, and we know how that feels, and turn that into power. And so a lot of that works happen, and all of the pedagogical training, I think, is layered on top of that. And so it's a lot of like the work of the heart, and then the work of the practical pedagogical skill that they will need, and then the work of the mind, right? Which and all of that comes together, and then and as Wendy was saying, I think it's so important once this really fully step into schools and classrooms, then to be able to help gently pull them back. And we do it in a number of ways. We have mass gatherings where everybody comes together. We have smaller, groups of 15 to 18 fellows coming together to share and reflect and problem solve. We have trainings. So we have lots of different ways, but all of those ways are really about pulling back and seeing, okay, what are we learning about how we're teaching, about our kids, about ourselves, about the system. And that kind of goes on for the full 2 years, I think. And that very much, as Wendy's sharing, is our effort to try and continue with our alumni. So that's, I hope that kind of answers.
Yeah, no, that really does, Khadija. And what I'm hearing from you is it is about the shared experience. It's 2 years of challenges, ups and downs. But what I hear you doing is you're also creating a container around it where you're bringing together people in community to make meaning of that experience. And what I also heard you say is you're also doing work to help them develop and be aware of some of the mindsets. Like Wendy, when you were speaking, you talked about mindsets. Like our work is systemic. We are trying to change the system. This mindset that we cannot do it alone. So we need to work collectively. This mindset that, we are all learners, that we are seeing students as leaders. And so Khadija, as you're talking about this work on self and identity work, the core idea is around these 2 years, but I love the container you're creating for people to step back, make meaning of that, do it with a diverse group of people, and actually challenge some of the underlying mindsets that we might have been socialized with. I'm starting to see some questions in the chat, so I'm going to throw one last question to you, Wendy and Khadija. And while I'm doing that, if anyone else has questions, start putting them into the chat so we can just bring everyone into the conversation. But I guess my last question is, anything else to share that we haven't had a chance to talk about today? So Wendy, maybe I'll throw it over to you. Anything that we haven't talked about that you feel it's important to put in the space?
I guess one thing that's on my mind, one thing I feel like I've come to understand over time, and maybe even just in recent years, is just the importance of the coherence of this work. Like we think about what we're trying to accomplish with students, like we're trying to develop students as collective leaders, which means we need to develop teachers in that way, which means we need to develop teacher coaches in that way, which means we need to develop ourselves in that way. Like there just can't be a break in the system. And I think we were really late in coming to that realization, actually, but that's probably my biggest lesson in this kind of work over the last few years, I guess.
Yeah, I love that, the through line. And I think one of the things I've realized is that, and it starts just in the classroom because kids can see through it. If a teacher is saying, hey, I want you to be a learner, but they're not modeling that and they're not modeling mistakes for young people, they're not seeing it, but same with us. And I've seen that across our network and how we've been thinking about growing our capacity around equity consciousness and dealing with our unconscious biases. That has happened at the global network, our staff, that's happened. Khadija, you were talking about that identity work with your staff, your fellows, but I've also seen that work now happen in the classroom, and it's so powerful when it's consistent, and it doesn't work when it's not. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Wendy. Anything else for you to share, Khadija? And I see some questions already coming into the chat, so we'll turn to those in a second. But yeah, last thoughts from you. Anything else you haven't had a chance to share?
I think I just want to extend what Wendy just said, and just say this. I think the coherence actually within the Teach for All world, I see it not just stop there. I see it very much from the global to the local as well. And I think that's really part of the beauty of this community. It's incredible. I mean, I think right now Teach for Pakistan is on a journey, and we are on a journey alongside many other partners at Teach for All, and the global team at Teach for All that's thinking about transformative student outcomes, right? What are really the life-changing things that we're seeing happen in incredible classrooms around the world for kids? And sometimes it takes my breath away when I step back and think about how incredible that is, right? There is a reason why so many of these program participants, just like Wendy saying, lots of people recruit and train, and that people have their own innovations on this. But across the board, you will see such a high bar of excellence for what do we want for kids, and such clarity of purpose, right? And I think it just comes from us being able to hold that coherence at every level, and every single person in that chain working hard to make that happen.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, the coherence, but also just the high expectations. And one of the things I've seen across our global network is we also fuel each other to have the high expectations, but also the sense of possibility. I've seen that when someone is stuck in one context, oftentimes that ability to see someone from another context who's dealing with it gives a sense of inspiration. Or even the same thing, Khadija, that you've seen that at the local level with your community of fellows and alumni. Well, great. There's a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to start putting them out to you, Wendy and Khadija. So, one of the questions there, I'm going to start with a short one. I'll come back to the long one, is alumni. And you started talking a little bit about this, Wendy. Can you just share a little bit more? And I'll throw this to maybe both of you. What are we doing to foster the leadership of alumni, or maybe even share an example of where we're seeing systemic change, where we have many alumni coming together to just bring that to life?
Actually, maybe we start with Khadija, because I think this question is really about what are we seeing from the alumni? Like, are we seeing them exert leadership and, in fact, in turn influence other leaders? And maybe you can start by what you're seeing in Pakistan, Khadija.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. I think to my mind, the biggest example, honestly, that comes to mind is we have and there are a number of nonprofits working in the space, in the education space in Pakistan. The largest of them is very influential. I think it has over 1,600 schools across the country, and it's like a 35-year-old, 40-year-old organization. And over the last 10 years, there's been an influx, I think, of about, I'm guessing at this, but close, 25 to 30 alumni who've worked with this nonprofit. And just the dramatic ways in which this now institution has transformed as a result of the kind of thinking and work they've done. I mean, you asked me about so it's like so many things. It's like working on making breakthroughs in early childhood education and what that should look like. Because that's very important in a context like Pakistan, those early investments in kids. And we don't have very many great models reaching out to kids at the bottom of the pyramid. You have lots of examples of early childhood interventions for kids who come from privilege and go to elite private schools. Another innovation that's come out of this has been a breakthrough model in being able to do life skills and literacy programs for children who are out of school. And in a country where 23 million kids are out of school, that's so desperately needed, because we don't have our government or nonprofit or private sectors don't have the bandwidth to construct enough schools in time to serve all these kids who are out of schools. And so I think some incredible examples coming out of there. And I think when you ask how they fostered new leadership, I think that really comes from all of these alumni who are working within school systems or directly in schools, and the way that they are working with other school teachers. Some of them are involved in principal recruitment and training. Some of them are involved in managing regions of schools. I think that's where they have the most dramatic impact on nurturing what the next generation of leadership in classrooms is going to look like. And then I think the other big example that I'll share is the most talked about reform anywhere in Pakistan in the last 10 years has been in Punjab. And that reform it's massive, funded by lots of international donors and also in part by the government itself. And within that reform, working with government, working with donors, working again from the other end, from communities and schools, a lot of Teach for Pakistan alumni involved in thinking through and trying to come up with breakthrough strategies around How do you recruit teachers differently? How do you prepare teachers differently? What do textbooks need to look like? And so I think we're still early on. I'm expecting this to really blow up in the coming few years, but those are some examples that I can share.
Yeah, and I think Khadija sort of brought to life what we see. It feels like such a similar movie playing out in all these different countries, and it really does just exponentially grow over time as the alumni gain more experience. But overall, we're seeing more than 70% of these folks who come in so unsuspecting, committing just 2 years, they're computer science majors and political science majors, and the next thing, but they really don't leave the work. That many stay full-time in education, maybe not in the classroom. Some of them stay in the classroom, others become school leaders, others move into the ministries, they work for NGOs in education. And even beyond that 70 some percent, many others are working from other parts of the system, but in ways that help contribute to the systemic changes that we need to see. I also think, first of all, to the direct question, one of the most common pursuits is around teacher development, because you just realize what a huge lever it is in the system. So, to the extent that we have a whole community of practice among the alumni who are working contribute to teacher development or school leadership development. It's just a hugely common pursuit, but alongside many others, from designing new types of schools to taking on, all the different pieces of the puzzle. And last thought is just, it feels to me, I've always thought that the way this plays out in communities, it's not really just about these people we're recruiting and developing. It's about sort of what they're helping alongside others to inspire and support in others. They're working to foster their students' leadership. And, it ends up showing a lot of people what's possible and bringing the veteran teachers back to what drew them into the profession in the first place. And so I think, again, not to overstate their impact, but, I think it really becomes a kind of catalytic force for much broader collective leadership far beyond our own people.
Yeah, I think it's something we've heard in some of the past People First talks. What's the capability of one leader to enable the leadership of so many others? And we're seeing that across students, other teachers. Here I'm sitting in Estonia and I was chatting with some of the alumni and they said, yes, we can do the work alone. But that's going to just have this much impact. So how are we working with the other teacher networks? There was a headmistress working in a community of 4,000 people. She said, well, we're not going to do this work without activating the leadership of parents. And so that's a big priority for her. And so we're just seeing this across the network. There's a great question in the chat that talks about, what actually helps get systems unstuck? What are the levers? And one of the ideas that some people put in front is the important or highest leverage point for change is for leaders to focus on shifting mindsets at the personal level. And Wendy, you got to this, sometimes we talk about system change at this big level, it's just policy change. It is that, and it's so much more. So it happens at the system level, it happens at the community level, but it also happens at the level of mindsets. And so Khadija, I know you think a lot about this in your program. What are some of the mindsets you see shifting? I think Wendy spoke about some of those, right? Seeing our work as systemic, working collectively. And are there other mindsets you work to actively shift, throughout your fellowship? Can you give us some examples of what you're seeing there?
Sure. Rather, I didn't see the question in the chat. Is the question about the mindsets of our program participants or the people who they engage with?
I think you can just start with even just the program participants. So so the one of the questions was, the highest leverage, some people say that the highest leverage point for change in leaders is to focus on shifting mindsets, to focus on that personal work, that inner work. You started talking about that with the identity work. Yeah, just bring that to life a little bit more. What shift do you see in participants' mindsets as they go through this program? And then you can also talk about what mindsets are you seeing them helping them shift in the systems around them.
Yeah. I think so. And we generally, we're recruiting talent that is going to have an orientation to growth and learning, and we look for a certain degree of humility. But I think the biggest one that I've heard from people is doing this work day in and day out. Any sense of entitlement that people come in with about, I worked so hard to get where I am, that kind of drops for them. Because of course they worked hard, but there's a real deep realization of all the systemic factors that worked to support them. Or they had one factor that kind of saved or rescued them, and then a deeper appreciation for that. I think that's a big one. And that I think results in them wanting to be that force, be that adult in their kids' lives for today, and then remember how that feels as they become alumni. I think the other one that we have grown over time to improve in our program, because that was a really big one we were seeing, is I think particularly if your context is in turmoil, which I think there's been a fair bit of turbulence, political, financial, in the last few years. And of course, COVID had turned everything upside down. I think a feeling of self-efficacy is something that we were seeing that our participants were struggling with. I think that has, the more going back again to the point of reflection and being able to step back and see, I think that has really improved. And I think that's been a game changer. Do people feel after this program, because I think the game that we have to play in this, with ourselves, I don't mean it in a cavalier manner when I say game. I think the whole trick is to be able to let your heart break, but then let it heal enough that you can act. Because otherwise we would just be helpless, right? We wouldn't be able to take any action. And so I think that being able to really face the truth and then still be able to act from a place of hope, and belief that you can do it and you should want to do it, I think is a really important one. Last one, I think that I may be overstating a little bit right now, but my hope is that it's something that really sticks with people, is Pakistan needs its best people to stay in Pakistan. That feels really, really important, because I think we're losing our top talent in massive numbers right now. And I think my hope, and let's see the coming surveys will tell us, and people being here will tell us. My hope is that this program builds the relationships that keep you here longer term.
Yeah, thank you, Khadija. I love that what you started with. There's some mindsets we have to unlearn, right? I worked hard, and so that's what changes systems, and we have some unlearning to do around our biases, but just a sense of possibility, that I can do something in the system. And I think what brought us all here is we need local leadership. We need people to stay in the system, and recognizing each person's role in that. And yeah, Wendy, anything you'd add, just as you've been reflecting on this over the years?
I would just say, I think Brendan's question here is it's such a huge driver behind what we do. Like, I think we believe so much that system change does start with ourselves. And I guess that's the thought behind the idea that we need coherence. Like, what we know that the kids in our classrooms today, like how they're developing, like that's the best predictor of the world we'll have in the future, right? Like, but in order to reshape that, like all of us need to change. And we've done all these studies across countries as well about what are the mindsets that differentiate the teachers who are getting these transformational outcomes. And they're people who see their students as whole people who can lead, who see themselves as learners, who see the assets in communities, who see the challenges as systemic rather than as issues inherent in kids or families. And I think if we could affect massive mindset shifts, at least in this work of ours around kids along those lines, we would change the system. Like, and a lot of what we do is just trying to micromanage adults who actually learn, we're all product of the old system. So we have a different set of mindsets often. So we need to kind of unlearn how we were taught and learn a different way of being. But instead, we often just try to micromanage the adults into being different. And it just doesn't work. Like, we need to support the personal change, and that will make everything easier.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. It's the work I deeply believe in. So thank you. Yeah, thanks for bringing that to life. We have a couple of other great questions in the chat, so I'll throw a final couple ones at you. Angie had a question around, what's the political reception of this approach? Eager, cautious, and maybe just to build on that, how do you build coalitions? How do you grow leadership across boundaries? Khadija, maybe you can share thoughts on that, and Wendy as well. And what does that imply for how we do the work as well?
Yeah, I think that the way that Teach for Pakistan's approach here has been received, I think there's a lot of excitement about a few specific components of our model, and I think the thing that gets the best reception is that we are able to provide better quality teachers in low income schools that they would never otherwise be able to access. And I think that's the thing that's resonated the most, because it is one of the most immediate problems that, and everybody knows it. It's not something that anybody would disagree on. Our teaching force, the recruitment, the selection, the training, and ongoing development of that teaching force is one of Pakistan, if not the single greatest challenge within education right now, I think, for us. So I think that's received a great reception. Of course, when you actually place the teachers in schools, the idea and theory is a great one, but then there's like interesting tensions that happen at the local level, right? Because change is always hard and painful, and when you start to kind of intervene in schools that have been operating in a very specific way for the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there's bound to be tension and conflict in the beginning. And so I think we see those interesting patterns. So I think sometimes, particularly for people in government, sometimes Teach for Pakistan is an acquired taste. But what I've come to see is that when they start to see the impact on ground, it's kind of irrefutable, and that's when the loop closes. What we're trying to do still is do the work that essentially this community is doing, is build greater traction for the idea of what happens with these people after 2 years, and how can they be more directly plugged into policy, because every time people have ended up in policy, it's been through a struggle. There are no easy existing pathways for that to happen. And so that's the interesting kind of element of the problem that me and my team and my board are still trying to work through.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And something you talk about is just, again, the power of engaging with communities, which maybe I'll bring it to maybe the last question we have. We have a question here from Laura around, how you're thinking about recruiting and selecting, but, is it an outside-in force, or how do you involve communities? And so maybe, Wendy, you can take that question in recruiting and selecting, but even more broadly, like, how do we think about this not being an outside-in force, but deeply embedded in working with communities?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I do think that the starting point for these organizations at this point is to really engage with the communities themselves before they ever even begin, to understand what it is that they want for their students, for their young people. So meaning, like, really taking a lot of time to build relationships with students and families and teachers and others in any given local context where the organizations start working. And that's kind of the foundation for true partnership, right? Like, if we're working for something different for kids than what the community wants, then it all falls apart, right? So like, then everything can be backwards mapped from there. And we've seen such fantastic innovative work across the network to engage the local communities in actually developing the selection model for the teachers, co-creating it with these organizations, and even helping in and being part of the selection process. I would also say that, the organizations, and Khadija referenced this earlier, are thinking so deeply about, like, given our objective of system change, who do we need to recruit? And we really believe that we need to recruit a diverse coalition of folks. We need people who, experience these exact inequities, are part of the same, grew up in the communities where we're working, and we need some of the most privileged people in our societies. I mean, we know how the world works, right? To gain proximity and be, part of the effort to change the system. One of our core values around diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, which brings our network together is around the idea that we need to be led by people who've experienced the inequities, and we need an inclusive community because we all have a role to play in supporting that direction. So I think it's such a great question, and one that gets a tremendous amount of attention across our network, and that plays itself out slightly differently, of course, in different parts of the network and all. But it's just a super important ongoing question and pursuit.
Khadija, anything else to say on that? And I think that'll be a final question. We'll wrap it up. Any final thoughts from you on that question, or anything else left to say?
I mean, the way that I think about it is we've too long in Pakistan, we like living in our silos, particularly when it comes to class. So to me, it doesn't make me uncomfortable. I think a little bit of I'm not sure if I'm taking away the same interpretation as the spirit in which the question was asked, but a little bit of the outsider going in and embedding themselves and developing the relationships and developing belonging with each other. I think that's very, very important for our society. Where else will we build these bridges if not here? I think this is very much the way I see it, is that I see this very much as a core part of really nation building, in its fullest sense. So yeah, that's all, rather.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Wendy and Khadija, for your thoughts. I think what just came out is this idea that leadership exists at all levels. We need many, many different people working towards solutions, working towards a shared purpose. And it's not easy work, right? It takes shifting mindsets. It takes time. It takes breaking down some of these traditional silos in society. And it also takes breaking apart kind of traditional leadership models that have assumed everything happens top down, and turning it on its head and saying, there's a different way. So thanks, Khadija, for the work you do, and Wendy for shedding light on how we think about this across the global network. And thank you all of you for joining and for your great questions. And we'll be in touch soon with some summary from this talk, as well as a preview of our next talk ahead. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Thank you, everyone.